African leaders are adopting a united position on climate change in the upcoming Copenhagen summit. They demand reparation for the ills committed by major polluters. Can there ever be a commitment of aid or compensation from the developed world to counter the effects of global warming? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Hashim Al-Barra. African leaders are calling for $65 billion in compensation over damage caused by pollution. They are meeting this week in Addis Ababa to decide how to move forward at the Climate Change Summit in December. This is the latest in a series of meetings where leaders have agreed to work together to demand reparations from the world's major polluters. Since world industrialization, African countries have contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions, but they are suffering the most from effects of global warming. Deforestation, drought and disease contribute to a disproportionately high mortality rate in Africa, especially when compared with the world's industrialized regions. For instance, the US state of Texas alone emits more carbon dioxide than all of sub-Saharan Africa. In America, it's estimated just 2 out of every million people die from effects of global warming. In Africa, that number is 120 in every million. That's around 150,000 deaths every year. To further discuss the impact of climate change and the best way to move forward, we are now joined by our guest in Stockholm, attending the European Development Day's annual forum, Mr. Emmanuel Mori, President of the Federated States of Micronesia. In Nairobi, Irungu Houghton, Pan-Africa Director of Oxfam, and also in Stockholm, Margot Wallström, Vice President of the European Commission. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Let me start by asking Mr. Irungu in Nairobi. Africa is now united. Africa is asking for $65 billion in compensation for climate change. Is this a realistic move?
I think it is a realistic demand to make of the rich countries that the impact that global warming is having on Africa be addressed very quickly and very directly by a clear set of new additional financing that is reliable and is sustained in order to meet the effects of global warming.
Margaret, in Stockholm, we know that there's a summit, a very important summit in December. There are high expectations that this is going to spell out a new platform for a better world. But are you a little bit concerned with the Africans setting the standards high and saying if you don't answer their demands, they're going to pull out from the meeting?
I am not concerned about the African countries or the other developing countries that are most affected by climate change. I'm more concerned about the offers on the table, because this is what we want to see. We in the European Union have taken a first step to present a kind of calculation and an offer. Some say that that will not be enough, but I think it's good to start the negotiations. And I would call this whole issue a matter of climate justice. And that is the core political issue that we will have on the table also in Copenhagen.
Mr. President Mori, during your address to the United Nations General Assembly, you portrayed a very apocalyptic picture of the future that your nation faces. Threat of being submerged, storms, disasters, a nation that could disappear. What do you think is the best way to tackle this issue? Compensation, as the Africans are saying, or a more thorough review of the whole Kyoto Protocol?
Well, I'm not sure about the amount of money that is on the table. I think every country and every region must demonstrate the need to work together and also proclaim just how much the climate change is affecting each and every one of us. I watched Maldives. They even went as far down in the deep ocean to sign something over there. It's just demonstrating how important the issue is to deal with it. Now, I'm not going to say that the African approach is the best way. There are many approaches that we can take, but it's just a mere demonstration of the importance and urgency of this issue. So we must deal with it in our own way, but at the end of the day, we must deal collectively with the urgent issue.
Okay. Mr. Irungu, apparently the whole idea behind compensation comes from the emissions trading system, which has been brought forth in 2005, where carbon credits could be auctioned off exactly like you do with any commodity. But do you think this is really an efficient way to deal with the crisis, the climate change crisis?
I think any strategy must, or any basis for the global deal that we expect in Copenhagen must start from the premise initially that what is happening is disproportionately felt by different parts of the world, and Africa, produces less than 5% of the emissions, the global emissions. That the world currently experiences, but is disproportionately going to be impacted upon by that, by the effects of global warming. The rich countries produce something like 75% of the global emissions. They have the resources to be able to adapt, to be able to be able to allow their citizens to be able to go on without much hindrance. But in Africa, that impact is a death sentence. We had several community leaders meeting in Cape Town recently on a Pan-African climate hearing, and we heard time and time again the impact that global warming is having on food security, on HIV/AIDS, on the contraction of malaria and other diseases. In many ways, if we do not address this, we are actually choking the very life of our planet, the very lungs of our planet. I would like to disagree, perhaps friendly, with the European Commission spokesperson, in that whereas the European Commission had shown leadership at the beginning of the year by stating very clearly what their cutbacks would be in terms of global emissions, we've seen that position curl up and go silent,
we'll definitely
perhaps to assuage the latecomer from the United States.
And
I think we need to be calling on the European Commission to provide leadership.
Absolutely. If I may interrupt you, we'll definitely come back and talk about the role of the EU, and particularly during the December Copenhagen summit. But let me go to Margaret. Margaret, after 2005, a new reality emerged whereby every country, particularly the rich industrialized countries, can buy allowances of greenhouse gas emissions like permits. So if, for example, the United States of America is overusing its own permits or allowances, they can buy it from Niger. But you have many experts saying that this is really a flawed scheme which can further destabilize the already fragile ecosystem.
It all depends on how you set the cap. That is, how much of CO2 is allowed to be emitted in such a system. And the emissions trading system was set up in order to be able to use the market mechanisms to be effective in fighting climate change, and also to be cost effective. And that will, I think, affect our credibility worldwide. So I think if we can use the market forces for the good of fighting climate change, that is absolutely laudable. So we want to make sure that an emissions trading system for the future is a more effective one by also being much stricter in the way you distribute allowances or how you create and set up such a system. I am sure that it can be made an effective tool, as we have seen also in the United States, and where this was initially used. But it all depends on exactly how you set the rules, and that you create a cap on the number of emissions or the amount of emissions.
Well, exactly. We do understand the mindset in Europe. We know that Europe is really very pleased with the idea of carbon trade. Mr. President, according to this new law, which has been floated in 2005, countries could be given these allowances, but there are claims that some nations have been over-allocated permits whereby they can just resell it back, earning billions of dollars. Do you agree, as president of Micronesia, a country that is really facing loads of problems with the very notion of carbon trade as the best possible scenario to deal with the climate change?
I think that is one way to deal with it. I'm not quite sure how accurate the allocations are and who is really benefiting from this allocation. If there is allocation, then we, as non-emitter of gases, what do we earn from this allocation? But I suppose it is permissible if that's what everyone wants. But I suppose as the non-emitters, we want to know what is our share of this scheme.
All right. In December, delegates from 192 countries will hold 2 weeks of talks in Copenhagen to establish a new global treaty on climate change. Concerns over global warming have been steadily expanding. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was drafted, committing countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 5% by the year 2012. However, the US, one of the world's biggest emitters, has never ratified it. The Kyoto Protocol came into force in 2005, when the melting of the Greenland ice sheet reached record levels. 2 years ago, at a UN conference in Bali, governments agreed to start work on a new negotiating process designed to tackle climate change, with the aim of completing it by 2009. The Copenhagen talks mark the end of that 2-year period. It comes as atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide reach 387 parts per million, the highest level for more than 500,000 years. Low-lying countries around the world face the most dramatic risks from global warming and climate change. Rising sea levels are expected to submerge large land masses around the globe, with Micronesia and the Maldives amongst those threatened with being completely submerged in the next few decades. Holland, too, faces the possibility of losing a large part of its land to rising water levels, but the wealthy European nation has built a sophisticated system of dikes that it hopes will counter the flooding danger. Experts say such a system can be emulated across the world, but many of the at-risk countries, such as Bangladesh, cannot afford it. On the other hand, Indonesia has huge hydrocarbon wealth, but protecting all of its 17,000 islands may not be feasible. Mr. Irungu, Africa emits less than 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, but still it bears the brunt of the whole climate change. What do you think the Europeans or the richest countries should do to tackle the issue, to help Africa?
I think there are essentially two things that would form a credible deal in Copenhagen over the next 7 weeks or so. The first is that we reach an agreement that all countries, that they reduce their global emissions by 40%, and that is the standard upon which countries will emerge from Copenhagen and be able to monitor and benchmark themselves in terms of their performance. To go back to your earlier point, or our earlier points about carbon trading, I think it's really important that an unsustainable way of life, an unsustainable economic system should not be used, should not be allowed to continue in a context where they simply compensate for essentially a bad management of the environment. The second thing that I think we need to look towards is a very clear set of figures. Within Oxfam International, we are calling for $150 billion by the period 2020, and that should be on stream and made available every year to enable countries across the world, particularly those in the south, to be able to deal with issues of adaptation and mitigation. Only those two aspects, I think, will respond adequately to what essentially is not an environmental disaster only, but it is a developmental disaster.
Okay.
And it affects the world's poor very directly.
Margaret, the EU has pledged to cut emissions by 95% in 2050 if other countries join the whole deal. But as you know, India and China are not going to be to come forward and say exactly what are their own benchmarks. Are you optimistic that a deal could be reached in Copenhagen?
I am still optimistic about Copenhagen, although we have been able to notice some problems in the process leading up to Copenhagen. And we would, of course, like to see more clear commitments also from the United States and China taking the lead. I just want to explain that, of course, what you do with the system of emissions trading, for example, is that you put a price on emissions of CO2. And it also means that if you can cap these emissions, if you can set a clear target, then you will also be able to master the market forces. And it means that you will reward those that can actually be very effective in cutting emissions, and you will also be able to sort of punish, or you will have a price to pay for those that are not as effective. This market will also mean that from the income you will be able to generate money that could be used for both adaptation and mitigation in the developing world. We have set ourselves clear ambitious targets, and they are based on scientific advice. And I think this is a good way forward. But we also say we need the others on board, and we need to make sure that we can create a system which is sustainable. I think, for example, that the small island states have always been very vocal in I would say, leading the debate on the effects of climate change, and I think Africa is also able to do that more and more.
Margaret, to do that, you need to overcome political divisions among the EU, and for this, I need to ask Mr. President Emmanuel Mori. Countries like Poland are saying that we're not going to agree with any compensation because we don't want our money to go to countries like India and China, which are doing good in terms of economic progress and growth. How do you think these divisions among the EU, which is pledging to play a key role in the climate change, be overcome?
Well, it's unfortunate that there is still division, but I can understand. This debate is very difficult. The issue is critical, but at the end of the day, we need to agree. No matter what, we need to agree, small, big, rich, or poor. I honestly think that if we don't strike anything in Copenhagen, then especially us who are most vulnerable in the Pacific, we're going to suffer huge consequences. So we are asking all countries to contribute to this problem. It is not isolated to one country that contribute to this problem. I think any country that is, obtain success in economic growth must pay something to those of us that we are not contributing, to this problem. Not only that, but we have to help each other. Those of us who need help, we seek help from the countries, and even China. I agree that must contribute more because they are the fastest growing economy in the world, and so is India and others. I understand there is a developing country as there are growing economies, and I think they should, contribute their fair share to the problem.
Okay, Mr. Arungu, is it fair to ask the industrialized world to pay the compensation when we know that in Africa, with its long record of corruption, selling exploitation rights to the world's most infamous polluters, where presidents are not taking into account the demands of the people, and even if the $65 billion go to Africa, we don't know where it's going to end up?
I mean, I think it is still a matter of justice, and whether or not African systems are corrupt or not, there is still an issue about what we are doing to the planet and what it is going to do to poor people. I think the issues of good governance are critical, and that the funding, like all funding, needs to be put in budgets and in projects that are transparent and are held accountable, first and foremost, not by the contributing countries, but first and foremost by the citizens of those countries. And that is the basis upon which democracy and democratic governance is built upon. So I think that is a given. The issue really, in some ways, is whether or not we are going to see some very clear contributions or promises made in the Copenhagen process. And I think throwing it back to the European Commission, at least sitting here in Nairobi, a few miles away from the Addis meetings of the ministers, it's not very clear what is the figure that the European Commission will contribute to meet this 150 billion gap that is required.
Okay.
Or if you just take the position of the African governments, the 60 billion gap that is required.
Let's address the issue with Margaret. Margaret, you have experts and scientists saying that unless drastic action is taken in Copenhagen, we're going to face mass starvation, drought, diseases, a very, very grim future facing the world. Isn't this enough for the states which has pulled out from the Kyoto Protocol and other key actors to say, we have to change the chapter, we have to turn the chapter and think about a better world, environment friendly?
I think we are already at that stage where we also hear different signals from the United States accepting the scientific advice and also being willing to move ahead on these issues, willing to sit around the table to discuss also concrete commitments and targets, and that is a very important development. And I think we cannot let especially young people down in Copenhagen, because they will also bear the brunt of climate change. And don't forget the women, because I want to say also about the situation in Africa. It is very often women, they are the ones who have to fetch water and carry firewood, and it will affect them also at first. So I think at least we are the ones that have presented a kind of offer. I am sure that this will not be enough. I'm sure there will be tough negotiations to add to this, but we have a package, we have a clear target and commitment, and you can trust that we will also live up to our commitments, and we will have to sort out our internal debate, but now we need the US and China on board as well.
Okay, Mr. Emmanuel, you said in the past, talk is cheap. What I need now is urgent action to help my own people, because our islands are just 1 meter above the sea. If nothing is done, we might just disappear. Would you feel deceived if the Americans, the rich nations, say we haven't reached a deal in Copenhagen?
I would urge everybody, the developed countries, the emerging countries, economies, this is not only for us. We're not going to be the only one that would suffer, the small island countries. I can assure you, everyone would be affected. Developed countries, developing countries, and the poor countries like my country. So I would urge United States, European Union, Japan, China, and all the other emerging countries to please sign on in Copenhagen and close the deal. And I still stick to my point. We must seal the deal in Copenhagen.
So let's just hope that your concerns will be addressed in Copenhagen. Mr. Emmanuel Mori, Mr. Irungu Houghton and Margaret Wallström, thank you very much indeed for your contribution. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.